Genesis chapter 13. Abram went up out of Egypt, he, his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He went on to his journeys from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. There Abram called on the Lord's name. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks, herds, and tents. The land was not able to bear them, that they might live together, for their possessions were so great that they couldn't live together. There was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were in the land at that time. Abram said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Please, separate yourself from me. If you go to the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as far as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose the plain of the Jordan for himself. Lot traveled east, and they separated themselves from one another. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot was separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for I will give all of the land which you see to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring may also be counted. Arise, walk through the land in its length and in its width, for I will give it to you." Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Genesis chapter Key Points. Abram went up out of Egypt and into the south with his wife and nephew Lot, and returned to the place between Bethel and Ai. God blessed Abram and Lot each with flocks, herds, and tents. The land could not sustain them both, for their wealth was great. There was strife between the herdsmen of both Abram's and Lot's livestock. Abram told Lot to separate in peace as relatives. If Lot chose to move right, then Abram would move left, and vice versa. Lot chose the plain of the Jordan and traveled east. Abram lived in Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain as far as Sodom. After Lot separated from Abram, the Lord told Abram to look at the land northward, southward, eastward, and westward, as he would give all the land he saw to Abram and his offspring forever. Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre in Hebron. Abram built an altar there to the Lord. Genesis chapter
Ponder this.
Abram left Egypt with his life and all his blessings. Verses 1 through 2. Abram went up out of Egypt, he, his wife, all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. When Abram arrived in Egypt, he was looking for relief from a land afflicted by famine. He needed to provide food for his household, for Sarai his wife, Lot his nephew, and all his male and female servants. Abram had a plan. Abram was a stranger arriving into a land who had no fear of his God and no understanding of the destiny God had declared over his life. A great name, people, land, and nation. All the Egyptians saw when Abram arrived in Egypt was a man and his company, fleeing Canaan during a famine, determined to obtain shelter and food for survival. Abram came to Egypt in need, and all of Egypt was aware of his arrival because the beauty of Sarai was so striking she garnered the attention of the princes of Egypt and their king Pharaoh. The beauty of his wife Sarai put the entire household in jeopardy. Abram required a plan which would ensure he be welcomed, allowed to purchase food and seek shelter, and provide the protection from death by devious men who would slaughter him and his company in order to obtain his wife. Thus, the deception of introducing Sarai as his sister was enacted, a position which would curry favor while not being a threat and obstacle for anyone seeking to obtain her for their own. While this plan did provide Abram protection, it placed Sarai in Pharaoh's house with the expectation of a marriage to Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh then blessing Abram with riches for the prospect of Sarai. Now, Abram had a problem. Yes, his life was spared in that he was not killed because men wanted his wife. But now he had Pharaoh himself laying claim to a woman who was not available, and riches given to him under the guise of Sarai's availability. Having told everyone Sarai was his sister, and having received riches from Pharaoh, how could Abram now reveal the truth without the wrath of Pharaoh? The lives of Abram, Sarai, Lot, and all those under his care were now faced with increased danger at this predicament. Abram needed the truth to be revealed to Pharaoh without the wresting judgment of death from a king who would view the circumstances as nothing more than a ruse to swindle money out of him and make a mockery of his interest and generosity. Abram needed God to step in and handle the situation of his own making. The might of God needed to be put on display in a way Pharaoh could not deny. The judgment on the house of Pharaoh needed to be severe enough for him to take notice, obvious enough that Pharaoh understood the taking of Sarai was the cause, and dangerous enough it would stay the hand of Pharaoh from retaliation against Abram. Pharaoh understood Abram was not just a stranger in his land seeking food and shelter. He was not simply another traveler hoping to extend his life in a time of crisis. He was not passing through Egypt at the mercy of his people, land, and might. Abram was a man who moved under the protection of a God who made it known Abram was not alone and unprotected. He moved under the covering of a God who ensured that to come against Abram meant affliction, judgment, and even death. Pharaoh was then faced with a problem. How was he, a ruler over all his land, a king who ruled the entirety of his nation on his word alone, going to let the deceit of a complete stranger who should be at his mercy live? Would doing nothing in retaliation of a lie make him appear weak? Would allowing Abram to retain the riches gifted by his house not amount to letting a thief keep his property obtained by cunning, deceit, and misrepresentation? Would not seeking a price of some kind not encourage other strangers to test the generosity of Pharaoh? Would not the boldness and mockery perpetrated by Abram and Sarai not be spread throughout Egypt and beyond? After all, would not the swindling of Pharaoh be put on display, and tales of the cunning of Abram not show Pharaoh in a bad light? How could Pharaoh, great king that he was, allow such an affront on his house stand? Surely he must make an example of Abram, lest anyone seek to also hold Pharaoh in derision. And yet he did not retaliate against Abram, because the vanity of his situation and forthcoming subsequent tales of the Sarai incident paled in comparison to the supernatural power, display, and might of God. While everything in Pharaoh must have demanded retribution, the fact Abram left Egypt with Sarai should not be taken lightly. Many great signs by God to Pharaoh needed to take place for Abram to leave Egypt, not only with those whom initially crossed into Egypt, but also with the people, riches, and food he obtained while in Egypt. Because of the might Pharaoh witnessed at the hand of God, he chose to allow Abram to take his wife and all the riches he had acquired through him in Egypt, and depart in peace, albeit in great haste, with an escort to ensure Abram left Egypt, and with protection to ensure no harm came to him during his departure. Abram and Lot eventually separated. Verses 5 through 9. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks, herds, and tents. The land was not able to bear them, that they might live together, for their possessions were so great that they couldn't live together. There was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land at that time. Abram said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Please, separate yourself from me. If you go to the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right hand, then I will go to the left." Abram was married to Sarai and lived in his father's house along with his relatives. The Lord told Abram to leave his country, father's house, and relatives and go into an unknown land to pursue a promise for his future. And while Abram obeyed God and left his country and father's house, he did not leave behind all his relatives. He brought along his nephew Lot. Abram loved Lot, the son of his deceased brother Haran, and may have taken him with him on this new journey simply because he was family. However, Abram was told by God he would be a blessing, become a great nation whose descendants would inhabit the land, and yet Abram had not yet had a child, as his wife Sarai remained barren. Abram attempted to keep Lot in his life despite the Lord's direction to leave his relatives behind. Abram's motivation in including Lot in his journey may be he viewed Lot as the fulfillment of the promise, not having sired an heir. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, lends credence to this viewpoint as he wrote, "Now Abram, having no son of his own, adopted Lot, his brother Haran's son, and his wife Sarai's brother. And he left the land of Chaldea when he was 75 years old, and at the command of God went into Canaan, and therein he dwelt himself, and left it to his posterity." Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 7, Paragraph 1. The Lord ensured Abram's household grew with abundance, increasing his male and female servants, sheep, cattle, donkeys, and camels after his brief stay in Egypt. Genesis 12. Abram dwelt in tents which required staff and servants to continually set them up and tear them down as he consistently moved throughout the land with his livestock and herdsmen who provided food and protection for his animals. From the abundance given to Abram then shared it with Lot, resulting in both Abram and Lot growing their livestock to such an extent the land, which also sustained the Perizzites and Canaanites, could not continue to provide for such a blessed household. Eventually, Abram and Lot needed to separate as their joint wealth was too much for them to remain together, as conflict between their herdsmen arose. Livestock translated into income. While the animals may have been a source of food, their existence also ensured Abram could sell or trade his livestock in the marketplace. Conflict between Abram and Lot's herdsmen was a serious issue affecting Abram's peace in his household as well as his finances. Abram realized that to maintain a good relationship with Lot, he needed to separate their households to preserve his peace and prosperity. Abram knew God was providing for him as he was living under a great promise and was building a future for a great nation. He believed he would receive all the promises of God. Therefore, he understood that to offer Lot the first choice of where to dwell would not be to his detriment. If Lot chose to inhabit the land to the right, God would bless Abram in the land to the left. If Lot chose the land on the left, God would bless Abram in the land to the right, because the blessing of wealth, abundance, and protection followed Abram. God himself would ensure Abram was provided for in whichever land he inhabited and passed through, as he had while Abram was in Egypt. Abram's complete obedience, verses 10 through 13 and 14 through 17. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose the plain of the Jordan for himself. Lot traveled east, and they separated themselves from one another. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked, and sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot was separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, and eastward and westward, For I will give all the land which you see to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring may also be counted. Arise, walk through the land in its length and in its width, for I will give it to you. God told Abram to leave his father Terah's house and country, to journey to a foreign land, as he would make of him a great nation. He would bless him and make his name great. He would be a blessing. He would bless those who blessed him and curse him who treated him with contempt, and all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Genesis 12. God had plans for Abram, and it involved leaving behind all that he knew in order to obtain a future for a coming nation. And while Abram did leave his father's house in obedience to God, he did not leave all his relatives behind. He brought along with him his nephew Lot. Lot was the son of his deceased brother Haran, whom Terah had adopted as his own son and whom later Abram had cared for. While this scripture does not indicate why God needed Abram to leave all he knew behind, Joshua, his descendant, 600 years in the future, would clarify the need for Abram to leave behind his relatives when he declared to his fellow Israelites, "The Lord, the God of Israel, says, Your fathers lived of old time beyond the river, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor. They served other gods." Joshua 24. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that Abram, at the command of God, went into Canaan, and therein he dwelt himself, and left it to his posterity. He was a person of great sagacity, both for understanding all things and persuading his hearers, and not mistaken in his opinions, for which reason he began to have higher notions of virtue than others had, and he determined to renew and to change the opinion all men happened then to have concerning God. For he was the first that ventured to publish this notion, that there was but one God, the Creator of the universe. Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 7, Paragraph 1. While Abram took Lot with him in his journey to the land of promise and cared for him, Lot was first raised by Haran his father and Terah his grandfather. Both of these men gave Lot his foundational learning, instilling in him values and morals which remained within him during his time under Abram's care. When God commanded Abram leave his home and all he knew, he was not trying to isolate Abram. He knew his relatives did not share Abram's love, attention, and obedience to God the Creator, for God knows the hearts and thoughts of man. 1 Chronicles 28. God knew Lot would not follow in Abram's example, that he would instead follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. And so the necessity for them to part came to pass through the dispute among their herdsmen. Lot looked at the beauty of the land towards Sodom and saw that the land was well watered and suffered not from drought, lack, or affliction. Lot was looking at and making his decision based on how the land looked at the present. A land as yet untouched by judgment on the wicked, as would soon come to pass on Sodom. Genesis 19. Lot not only chose the land towards Sodom, but pitched his tent right next to that wicked city. Lot chose to establish his household in close proximity to evil because he could not discern the danger. After Lot chose his direction, Abram then chose the land of Canaan, choosing to follow God's direction to inhabit his land of promise. Lot knew of Abram's promise. He knew God had established Abram would prosper in Canaan, and so moved to its southernmost border, so as to still be in Canaan and benefit from Abram's promise in God, in the lush and verdant land, and yet encamp at the door of wickedness. Only after Abram's separation from Lot did God reinforce his promise to Abram. Only after Abram's complete obedience to God in leaving all his relatives behind did God specify Abram would have offspring who would be too numerous to count, and encourage Abram to walk the land of his promise. Only after Abram was no longer harboring compromise within his household did God reveal the entirety of his promise to Abram. Abram built altars to the Lord, verses 3 through 4 and 18. He went on his journeys from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. There Abram called on the Lord's name. Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. God told Abram to leave his father's house and country, to journey to a foreign place. God had plans for Abram, and it involved leaving behind his father, relatives, and all that he knew in order to obtain a future for his coming promise of a great name, blessings, and eventual nation. Joshua, his descendant 600 years in the future, would clarify the need for Abram to leave behind his relatives when he declared to his fellow Israelites, "The Lord, the God of Israel says, your fathers lived of old time beyond the river, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor. They served other gods." Joshua 24. When Abram entered the land of Canaan at God's instruction, the Lord appeared to Abram and gave him a magnificent promise. He, a man with no heir and no prospects of obtaining one as his wife was barren, would not only father a child, his son would begin his legacy of descendants, who would then form a nation and inhabit the land of Canaan. So moved was Abram by God in his promise, he built an altar to the Lord in gratitude and thanksgiving, a living memorial to his God for his favor and faithfulness to him and his future descendants. Genesis 12. What is interesting is the location of this altar. The mountain where Abram built the altar to the Lord was set between two cities, Bethel and Ai. In Hebrew, Bethel means house of God, and Ai means heap of ruins. Abram literally built an altar to God between the place of worship and ruins. This literal location between the choice to serve God or face ruin is echoed in the future words spoken by Joshua to fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in which land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24. Abram's altar honored the God who brought him out of a land filled with idolatry and promised him a land for him and his future offspring, a people who, like Abram, would become his people and serve him with righteousness. Abram chose to believe in God, chose to follow God and his commands, and reinforces his choice by building him a memorial between two cities who embody the freedom to either remain in the house of God or inhabit a heap of ruins. Ultimately, every person must make this choice, for God would rather you be hot or cold and not lukewarm, or he will vomit you out of his mouth. Revelation 3. When Abram came out of Egypt and into the land of Canaan, he revisited the altar he had first dedicated to God. He had come through a strenuous ordeal and returned to the altar between Bethel and Ai to give thanks and honor to God for his provision, protection, and deliverance, reinforcing his dedication to God and offering him a sacrifice of praise. Hebrews 13. Abram then moved on, settled, and built an altar to God by the oaks of Mamre. This location would become a meeting place between him and God. God would then visit him to declare his name would be changed to Abraham and his wife Sarai's name to Sarah, as they would become the father and mother of nations. And he would declare Sarah would bear him the son of the promise within the year, Abraham being 100 and Sarah being 90 years old. Genesis 17. God would then visit Abraham at this location to inform him judgment was coming to Sodom and Gomorrah due to their wickedness. Genesis 18. Because Abram trusted God with all aspects of his life, God trusted Abram with his promises and revelations. Abram's choice differed from Lot's choice. Verses 3 through 4, 18, and 10 through 13. He went on his journeys from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. There Abram called on the Lord's name. Abram moved his tent and came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose the plain of the Jordan for himself. Lot traveled east, and they separated themselves one from another. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked, and sinners against the Lord. God promised Abram his name would be great. He would have a multitude of descendants, and his offspring would inherit the land of Canaan. This promise was given centuries before its manifestation. However, God so loved Abram for his righteousness of faith, Genesis 15, he allowed Abram to walk on the land, see with his eyes, and experience the promise centuries before his descendants would inherit the land. Abram believed in God and his promises. He trusted in God's provision and protection, and established altars to recognize, praise, and honor his God. Although Lot had Abram as an example of righteousness, he did not offer praise or sacrifice to God. Instead, he chose to inhabit the land of Canaan, which was Abram's promise, purposefully placing his tent close to wickedness. Abram's choice, Lot's choice. Abram was raised by his father Terah, and although Terah followed idols, he chose to follow God and looked to him for direction. Lot was raised by Haran his father and Terah his grandfather, and may have followed in their footsteps of serving other gods. Joshua 24. Abram knew God's voice and heard him speak. Lot did not hear the voice of God. Abram followed God in obedience. Lot followed Haran, Terah, and then Abram in obedience. Abram followed the leading of God, professing his faith, and established a living memorial to God when he built altars to God in praise, worship, and recognition. Lot observed as Abram built altars to God in praise, worship, and recognition, and yet he did not follow his example when they parted ways. Abram believed God for his provision and knew even if he gave Lot the first choice of the land, God would ensure he prospered in the land of his promise. Lot did not defer to Abram as his elder, honoring him with first choice, nor did he seek his advice before choosing where to inhabit. Instead, he looked to nature and the current status of the plain to determine his location and provision. Abram chose to inhabit the land of Canaan as God has commanded, and purposed in his heart to live in obedience to God in righteousness. Lot chose to inhabit the land of Canaan at its most southern border, able to profit from the land of promise set aside for Abram, while purposefully choosing to establish his household right by a city of wickedness.
Genesis chapter quiz.
Congratulations!
You have now completed this chapter.
Thank you for watching. What did you find interesting about this chapter? How many questions did you get correct on the quiz? Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and comment down below. Turn on the bell button to get notified of new videos and catch up on past videos. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.